Hello class, and welcome back to our discussion on colonial America and the Atlantic world. When we last left off, we were talking about Christopher Columbus and how he had created or established sustained contact between the Old World and the New World. Uh, Once it became evident that Columbus had discovered something new, or at least new to Europeans, it kicked off a lot of explorations. A lot of people went trying to discover, conquer, claim, all of this stuff in the New World. And previously none of this was mapped. Nobody knew where this stuff, where it led or how big it was or anything like that. Um, but they all kept records. And at the same time all this is happening, we've had the Renaissance in Europe, and an invention called the printing press has become pretty important. A lot of people attribute this to a guy named Johann Gutenberg, but the printing press is actually an Eastern invention. It comes from China, but Gutenberg had adapted it to use the Latin alphabet. And most European, Western European languages use the Latin alphabet. So what this allowed Europeans to do is mass produce written documents. And anytime something's mass produced, it becomes cheaper and more available. And so as these accounts come back from the New World, as these explorations bring back written accounts, journals, maps, things like that, these things are mass produced. And what this leads to is something we call collective learning. Basically, humans as a species, we have the ability to communicate abstract thought. We can speak, so we can talk to other people and explain things to them. We can teach other human beings how to do things, and we can write things down and pass that knowledge along through written word. And so what's happening is a lot of Europe is becoming very aware of this new world, and people are learning very quickly, mapping this thing out. So for example, if you knew that there was Columbus's island, which is technically in the Bahamas, and you sailed from that starting point and found other islands, pretty soon everybody knows about those other islands, and you can use those as launching points to find other islands or the mainland, etc. So this new world, which was unknown before 1492, very quickly becomes a place of national interest for several different European empires. It's interesting, we name these continents, we tend to refer to them as the Americas: North America, South America, even the United States of America. That name America comes from a man named Amerigo Vespucci. He didn't name these continents after himself, but he is the man who came up with the term New World. So when we say the New World, that is something we attribute to Vespucci, this idea of it being a new world. He came up with that phrasing. But there was another guy, we were just talking about collective learning and taking these things people have written and mass producing them. So there was a German man named Martin Waldseemüller, and he was making a map based on Vespucci's writings. So he was converting what Vespucci had described into a map, and he didn't know what to call these land masses, and so he named them after the writer. He named them after Amerigo Vespucci, and that's why we get the name America, North America, South America. It is interesting to note, though, that even though today we don't really say it, for a long time in history, the terms America and Columbia were sort of interchangeable when referring to the New World. If you look at this map here, this is Waldseemüller's map. If you notice, the Americas are almost unrecognizable. They don't really look like what we know they look like, compared to, obviously we see Africa, Europe, and Asia look very familiar, but not the Americas, because of course these things are being mapped out as even as this guy Waldseemüller is making his map. So people don't know. It's still very mysterious how much land is there, and how far around it you would have to go to get around it or over it or under it or whatever. Another name here that we see, Juan Ponce de Leon. Most time we just call this guy Ponce de Leon. But Juan Ponce de Leon, he was a Spanish explorer, and he discovered La Florida. All right. Now, obviously, if you're reading this, you'll know that La Florida is our modern day state of Florida. However, what he actually discovered was that the landmass, if we're using the Bahamas as a starting point, it's not that far from Florida, but it's not clear either that that's not an island until you try to get to the other end of it. And so Juan Ponce de Leon he sort of discovers that, hey, this is not just an island, this is a landmass. And so when we say La Florida, what we're really talking about is North America, or at least the southeast. Think of everything from Virginia, maybe over to Texas, that whole area there, because this still needs to be explored. So when we say La Florida in this time period, it doesn't end, at the Georgia border. Georgia is part of La Florida. The Carolinas are part of La Florida, right? So keep that in mind. All right, so obviously Spain is going to have an interest in claiming this new world. Columbus was not Spanish, but he sailed for Spain. But now we're going to have expeditions to conquer this new world. And so these guys who lead these expeditions, these conquerors, as we call them in Spanish, the conquistadors. A lot of these guys were veterans of the Reconquista. And if you remember the Reconquista from our last lesson, we said that the Reconquista was a war to drive the Muslims out of Spain, which they did. And if you remember that year, the year that was completed was 1492. So it took about 700 years. But 1492 was the year the Reconquista was declared over. It was a victory. It also happens to be the year that Columbus discovers America. So in Spain, 1492, two major events: the discovery of the New World and the end of the Reconquista. So these guys who have been fighting the Reconquista, these Spanish soldiers, these knights, they are fighting with the expectation that the king will grant them lands and titles. And at the end of the Reconquista, they are now saying, hey, we want our reward. And luckily for the king, we've just discovered this new land in America. And so he says, hey, you can go to America and, claim land and titles there, claim it for Spain. And so that's what happens. So we get these conquistadors, and there's a bunch of these guys. There's a ton of them. We're not going to learn about all of them. We're just going to look at maybe 3 or 4. But these guys are all of them are going over exploring what we call the Caribbean, North America, South America, Central America. But there's a few that we need to talk about, because again, we are trying to tie this back to U.S. history. So we've been talking about Spain, we've been talking about the Americas, but let's get this, back to the U.S. and let's see how these few conquistadors that we're going to discuss helps with that story. All right, so the first guy we're going to talk about is named Hernan Cortez. All right, Hernan Cortez, he is famous for conquering the Aztecs. All right, you see there it says conquest of Mexico. Remember, the Aztecs, or really as they should be called, the Mexica, they live in Mexico. And he conquers these guys, takes the capital, Tenochtitlan. By the way, Tenochtitlan is today what we call Mexico City. You look at the timeline there, 1519 to 1521, that doesn't seem to take very long. There was a lot of controversy, there still is, over how he was able to do this. And at the time, what most people believed was, well, one, he was European, and so there was a sort of prejudiced element to how he was able to conquer the Aztecs. He was Catholic, and the Aztecs were obviously pagan, and so there's a religious aspect or a cultural aspect to how he was able to do this. And then there's the idea that, well, he had guns and he had armor and he had swords and he had horses, and this was the deciding factor. And of course, Those things are true. He had all those things. However, when Cortez first fought the Aztecs, he actually lost. The Aztecs defeated him, and he fled Tenochtitlan back further into the outskirts of the Aztec Empire. But there's the key word, empire. If you remember, an empire implies that the Aztecs have conquered other people, and these people pay tribute to them. And that's exactly what was happening here. There were a lot of indigenous people, a lot of Indians in Mexico who paid tribute to the Aztecs. They didn't necessarily like the Aztecs. They had been conquered. And when they realized that when Cortez was at war with the Aztecs, they decided to join forces and fight with him. And so now Cortez has not only his Spanish forces, but he has an army of Indian allies. And he takes those back to Tenochtitlan. But when he gets there, he finds something interesting. When he returns to Tenochtitlan with this Indian army, the Aztecs are all sick. They're either sick or they're dying. And the reason for that is when he went to Tenochtitlan the first time, soldiers in his army were carrying European diseases or old world diseases like smallpox. And we mentioned that when we mentioned the Columbian Exchange, that diseases are one of these things that get, cross the Atlantic. And for the native people of the Americas, this was really bad because they did not have the same cultural understanding of disease. Europeans realized that, hey, if somebody's sick, you better keep your distance because you'll get sick too. They had the idea of quarantine. They knew what a quarantine was, going back to the Black Death and things like that. Europeans were familiar with things like smallpox. And then you take into account that Europeans had, a lot of them had survived smallpox, which once you survive it, you're immune to it. They had, some type of biological resistance to it just based on maybe their parents surviving things and things like that. Whereas these Indians had none of this. They had no cultural understanding of these diseases. They had no biological resistance to these diseases other than, simply the immune system that human bodies have. And so this was devastating. And so Cortez is easily able to defeat the Aztecs with an army of Indian allies and with the advantage of biological warfare, unintentional biological warfare, but nonetheless, these Indians were sick. The problem became that when the Spanish sort of told the story, they told the story from that first point of view that, well, we had God, we had guns. They kind of ignored the Indian allies and the biological aspect to it. It's not something we really understood until later, but it is what helped him subdue the Aztecs. And eventually the Spanish made tributaries out of the Aztecs and created what we call the Viceroyalty of New Spain out of what is present-day Mexico. Another guy, Francisco Pizarro, so same story pretty much except with the Incas. Basically, everything Cortez did to the Aztecs, Pizarro did with the Incas. If you look there, it says conquest of the Incas, and it shows about a 50-year period. Obviously, Pizarro did not do all of that. But as far as sort of toppling the empire and seizing control of Cuzco, which was the capital, that happened fairly quickly, and for the same reasons: biological warfare, Indian allies. And so these two men, Pizarro and Cortez, they're pretty important in our story. Here's why, okay? Both cases, they had toppled empires. To this point, most of the Indians that the Europeans had encountered lived in small villages. For example, Columbus, the people that he encountered, these island-dwelling people, they lived in villages. They were naked for the most part. They were, basically subsistence-producing people. They were just trying to get enough food to survive. And then Cortez and Pizarro conquers these empires, and we see gold and silver. All right, how is this important? Okay, well, for one, it's going to make Spain very wealthy. And as we'll see, Spain will create the first global economy. But what's important to our story as far as American history goes is other European nations are seeing this as well. And so when Spain becomes very wealthy because of these conquests, obviously France is going to take note. England's going to take note. Other European powers are going to take note. All right, so eventually the English colonies will start, the beginning of the English colonies will begin because of a desire to basically get wealthy like the Spanish did. It's not going to work out the same way for them, but this is a motivator. Okay, the fact that Cortez and Pizarro conquered these empires. All right, now back to Pizarro. So he conquers the Incas, and one of the things that the Incas are very rich in is silver. And as we know, silver and gold are considered precious metals. They're very valuable. But you see another name here, Ferdinand Magellan. So let me give you a little bit of backstory. China, before Henry the Navigator, okay, before Henry the Navigator, before Vasco da Gama, before Columbus, China had actually sent out expeditions into the Indian Ocean. And they, this is during the Ming Dynasty, and they were looking for treasure and wealth and all this kind of stuff. But the conclusion that they came to after these expeditions was that nothing the world had was as good as the Chinese stuff. Basically, the Ming did not want to trade with other nations because they would be trading their valuable stuff for everybody else's, less than valuable stuff. And so the Ming Dynasty had closed its borders to the world. China was sort of sealed off. And if you remember, Eastern goods is really what we wanted. This finding the Americas was an afterthought, right? We want Eastern goods, and when we're in Western Europe, we want Eastern goods, and that that idea still exists. And so the problem is no one can trade with China. China is closed off, but there is one thing that China desires, and that thing is silver. And so once the Spanish start getting all this American silver, that will allow them to access the Chinese market. Now, at the same time, there's another guy, Ferdinand Magellan, who is sailing for Spain, and he is considered to be the first man to circumnavigate the world. You see a word there, circumnavigation. What that means is he basically charted a path to sail around the world. Now, we can't say he was the first man to sail around the world because he dies on the journey. He sails from Spain over to the Americas, goes around the southern tip of South America, across the Pacific, and he makes it to the Philippines. And he dies in the Philippines. And in fact, the Philippines are going to be named after the Spanish king at the time. But he dies in the Philippines, but his crew continues using his charts, and they sail all the way back, around Africa, back to Spain. And so Magellan's the first guy to circumnavigate the globe, but this Spanish silver, all right, allows the Spanish to access the Chinese markets. So we have Spain, which is a European empire, using American silver to trade in Spain. They have the Philippines, which is in Asia. They have, the Americas, and now they have, obviously Spain is in Europe. So Spain creates a global economy out of this. So Spain is very wealthy right now, very powerful. They won't stay that way. They won't last. They're not going to be a world power into the 19th century. But right now, because of Spanish silver, because of American silver that the Spanish control, they're a powerful nation, and this gets these other European nations' attention. So why are the Incas important to U.S. history? Because if it weren't for the Incas, England may not have even taken note in trying to colonize North America. So keep that in the back of your mind. All right, Hernando de Soto. So this is another conquistador. In fact, he was a veteran of Pizarro's campaign against the Incas. So he had fought the Incas. But he is going to launch an expedition into North America. And notice it doesn't say like conquest of the Incas or conquest of the Aztecs or anything like that. Because really what De Soto is going to do, he's going to explore the southeast. All right, he's going to explore North America. He's going to start in Florida. Now remember, all of this is La Florida, right? There is no Georgia border, no Alabama border. It's just all of Florida, according to the Spanish. But he lands there in 1539 in Florida, goes through Georgia, Alabama, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. All right, now he's looking for mineral wealth. He's looking for gold and silver. He's looking for a big civilization. All right, but he doesn't find it. But what he does find is those Mississippian chiefdoms we were talking about. In fact, this is how we know that these were chiefdoms and not what we see later, which is going to be confederacies, because of the writings of somebody like De Soto. But these chiefdoms don't have, big giant empires with gold and silver. And so he doesn't find what he's looking for. He keeps exploring, eventually crosses the Mississippi River. In fact, he's considered to be the first European to lead an expedition across the Mississippi. We have to word everything kind of weird because he probably wasn't the first European to see the Mississippi. He probably had scouts ahead of him and things like that. But he leads an expedition across, and he does end up dying on this expedition. Now, he doesn't find anything of mineral wealth. There's nothing comparable to the Aztecs or the Incas. But Spain still wants to profit off of this territory. So they're going to establish the mission system. Okay, now the mission system is basically going to be areas where Spanish people basically build plantations, and there's going to be a Spanish mission attached to it. And the idea is to convert the Indians to Catholicism, and then sort of exploit their labor. Pedro Menendez de Aviles, this is the first governor of Florida, and he's going to establish the capital at St. Augustine. All right, most of you guys listening to this are probably familiar with St. Augustine, but St. Augustine is the first permanent European city in North America. All right, first permanent European city in North America, established in 1565. All right, so this is going to be the capital of La Florida, sort of the base of the Spanish mission system, right? So you'll have little Spanish missions spread out throughout the southeast, but these will be basically, you might have a church, you might have a little fort, it might be a fortified church, you might have one or two Spanish priests there, a handful of soldiers, and everybody else will be Indians. All right, and then your main military force and all that will be back at St. Augustine. All right, so as I mentioned, this stuff gets the attention of other European powers, and so the one we'll mention right here is the French. So there's a French guy, Jacques Cartier. He's going to explore way north of North America. So obviously Spain is all the way from maybe Virginia all the way down. So he's gonna try to go over the top. And to be honest, he wants to find, again, everybody's trying to get to the east, right? You're trying to get to Asia. And he thinks, well, maybe you can go over the top of North America, which you can't, or at least you could not during this time because of the ice. But he ends up exploring the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the St. Lawrence River and mapping this out. He encounters Indians there as well. And he ends up calling this place the Canadas. All right, the Canadas, this is basically, it's his understanding of an Indian word for villages, because of the Indian villages he encounters. Obviously today we just know this place as Canada. But France is going to claim this, and they're going to call it New France. And basically this part of New France, the Canadas, is going to consist of two major areas, all right, Quebec and Acadia, and we'll hear more about those places later. But they don't find gold and silver either. There's no gold and silver, no big giant civilizations or anything like that, like the Incas or the Aztecs. But France is still going to find wealth. They're going to make money off the fur trade. So the Spanish are making money off of gold and silver primarily, also the mission system, and France is making money off of the fur trade. So here's two of our big empires, our two big empires involved in the Americas, France and Spain. Still haven't talked about England, and we're going to, but before we can talk about England, we have to talk about a big event that happens in Europe. All right, so remember, we're not just discussing um, colonial American history, we're discussing Atlantic world history. And yeah, we want to get to the US, but we can't talk about US history without talking about English colonial history. And we can't talk about English colonial history without talking about England. And so in our next lesson, we'll see something that happens in Europe that's a pretty big deal, and it has a significant impact on Europe and on England, and which will have an important impact on the English colonies. So stay tuned, and we'll deal with that in our next lesson. Thank you.